What a joy it is for me to be here with you today. I bring greetings from the First United Methodist Church in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And we are celebrating our 200th year since Methodism came to Tuscaloosa. And we had our big celebration day last weekend. And you've got yours coming up in a couple of years, I think. Wow. God has blessed this congregation and mine with a wonderful and rich history for which I know you and I are thankful. And I want to thank Stephen and you for hosting a national gathering it's called The Gathering. A group of preachers from around the nation get together once a year to share how is it with our soul and to visit with one another. Your pastor hosted us and we've had a wonderful, wonderful time together. It's always deeply meaningful. We met 5 years ago when we were newbies at this gathering. That's what they called us, newbies. I was flattered. You know, I'm of the age where being called newbie at anything is kind of fun. I don't think Stephen was as flattered, but I was delighted. Stephen and I, our spirits welded together in that gathering in Montgomery, and since then we have been friends. And it's amazing how those telephone calls go both ways. And I have been comforted by your pastor as well. I'm a regular participant in worship here via your archived worship services, that is. I worship regularly with you. I'm impressed with the stateliness of your music, the fun of your children, the creativity and the passion and the clarity and compassion of your pastor. As you know, Stephen is a gifted pastor, and with that, you are a gifted congregation. I love those occasions when Emily steps into the pulpit and she humbles Stephen. I have a wife that does that too. And I want to thank Stephen for the topic he gave me today. Of all the topics, he gave me my favorite, generosity, which I know you're calculating means stewardship, which means money. He's trying to get in our back pockets again. I know that's what you're thinking. Thank you, Stephen. My folks love it when I preach on money. You know, they say, "Preacher, you preach about it all the time. Can you preach another sermon on money this week?" They love for me to preach about money. Thank you, Stephen. Of all the topics, and we have a world full of great possibilities. And I'm here to talk about generosity. As a part of your Living Our Values series, I've been keeping up, and you know, this open to all. I know that you're a congregation that practices that kind of openness far more than mine does, I'm sorry to say. But also know that when it's one of your values, it does speak to what is, but it also speaks to what you want to be better at doing. Just like worship, you know, you touch a lot of people with worship, but I know that your folks are like mine, Stephen. They found out that they don't immediately go to hell if they skip worship. At least somebody told my folks that, and they're taking advantage of it. They don't come like they used to come. In discipleship, you know, loving others over time, something like that's the theme, the catchphrase. I mean, how wonderful. You do that, but I bet others of you could develop your discipleship a little more by practicing a little more. And you're a generous congregation, and so you practice generosity, but there's a level to which you could rise. I bet you have that aspirational nature. It's called gap analysis in business, the difference between where we are and where we want to be, and how do we get to there? I discovered that in the first church I served. This little rural congregation. There were like 4 of us that had college degrees, and so it was. They were really impressed with my degrees. I'll just tell you that. But we were struggling one day. The economy was bad in the 80s, as you'll remember, and the Monsanto plant had spent 10 years and about a couple of $1 billion building this enormous plant just across the river, and it employed hundreds of thousands of people. And in fact, they had several of our congregation. And after 2 years, the economy was so bad, they closed the plant down, totally closed it, laid off all their employees. we were trying to raise the budget, what for us was a significant amount. And I had a dozen families that just went on workman's compensation. So how in the world are we going to raise the church budget when everybody's on workman's compensation? So I decided I would take that as a premise. What if everybody in the church only made what workman's compensation gave, which was like $200 in those days? And so we looked at it. I figured out how many working families we had, and so there were about 80 of them, and that if $200 a week is what they got, that we had a congregational income of $800,000. And with moving the decimal point, that made, if everybody tithed, then that would be, we're in the Bible Belt. You know, we can talk about tithing. We believe that that's what we ought to do. And we don't always do it, but we believe we ought to practice that. And so if everybody tithed, that would be $80,000 budget. And I was trying to raise $40,000, and it would have been more than we'd ever given before. I just didn't do that when I was young and naive. I did it at Tuscaloosa not long ago. We had a $2.5 million budget, and we knew we could do better. 2.5, what was our possibility? You know, I'm pretty smart, so I figured out how many families we have live in each zip code, and I found out that through our census, we know what the average income, household income is for zip codes, and so I figured out our congregational income was $77 million. And so with an easy movement of the decimal, that means if everyone tithed, that would be a $7.7 million budget. And we were trying to raise $2.5 million. Somebody's not tithing down there, you know? I got insight to all that when a couple of years ago, my wife and I bought our house. Now, I'd lived in church-owned housing since I was 19 years old. When in 73, I started working for the church, and they provided me a place to live. I lived in a church parsonage. And I was always careful to say, I live in a house provided by the church. It's the church's house, but it's my home. The church's house, so that I always remember that it was a gift. And many times it was a house far more valuable than I could afford to live in, but I always reminded people that it was our home, so that there would be a place of sacredness for my wife and for my children, and the church's house, but our home. Until 3 years ago, I lived in a parsonage. We were preparing to retire, and wife says, "Can I buy a house?" I said, "Sure," hoping it would take her 1.5 years to find a house. 4 weeks, she found a house. In 5, we had a contract, and now I am a mortgage owner. But I have a house. I'm a first-time homeowner at 62 years old. I own a house. That first summer I was out in the yard, it was like 100 degrees in August, and humidity was 200 degrees, and it was just awful. And I thought, I'm mowing my lawn. I'm cutting my grass. Afterwards, we planted an azalea bush. I was digging. This is my dirt. I'm digging in my dirt. And there was a limb that I kept bumping my head when I mowed the grass. And so I trimmed. I didn't have to ask anybody's permission. I cut my limb off my tree. And then I realized the problem that Moses was worried about when he was going to turn his people free in the Promised Land. Moses had given the 10 Commandments, he had given the covenant code, he had given the holiness code, he had told us how we're supposed to relate to God and how we're supposed to relate to each other. And he says, but I'm really worried that when you go into that land and when you're living in a fine house and when you've cultivated the crops and you've received enough produce that you're going to build a barn, and you're going to put some away in the barn, and your vines are going to produce, and you're going to have wine, and you're going to have wine in the wine cellar, and you're going to have all you need, and your gold and your silver multiply. I'm afraid you're going to think, gee, look at all this that is mine, mine, mine. I have it all. It's mine.
This is a demonstration
of
Wirecast.
That God is the one who gives us the ability to produce wealth. It's a hard notion to understand. And we church folks ought to understand it, because from the beginning of creation in Genesis to the end of the story in Revelation, God is portrayed as the giver. In the beginning, God created, and He created us as human beings, and He said, this creation is very good. And to provide for us, He created all kinds of plants and trees. And when we said, can we eat of the blueberry bush? Of course. How about raspberries? Yes. What about apples? Apples are there for you to take. It's all there for you. Persimmons? Well, make sure it's after the first frost, because you don't want to bite into that too soon. It's all a gift. Now, there's one exception, and I'll let Stephen deal with that exception, but it's a gift. And in Revelation, when God's sitting on His throne, there's a river that flows from the throne of God, and trees grow up alongside, and people pick the leaves because the leaves are for the healings of all the nations. Why, if we remember the scripture that we see on TV by fanatics, God so loved the world that He gave, we see the nature of God there. God's the lover. God's the giver. And when we are at our best,
This is a demonstration of Wirecast.
we are lovers and givers too. When we can get over the idea that what is mine and it's a gift from God, then perhaps we can be a little bit more generous and raised to a level of generosity that honors God. There's a pastor, Bill Henson, who grew up in South Georgia, was a really good preacher, and he was called out of South Georgia to go to Houston, Texas, to the largest Methodist church, the First Church Houston. When he retired from there, he came to Alabama because his daughters had moved there, and he died a few years ago. He tells the story of when he was a boy preacher. He was going to Georgia Southern University, and he had been called by the district superintendent to go preach in a little rural church. And so he goes out there, and he's new at this, and so he stands in the pulpit and he begins to preach. And there's a boy sitting on the very front row, and he's barefooted, and he sits there on the front row just kicking his feet back and forth and back and forth. The entire time Bill's trying to preach, this little boy is kicking his feet just back and forth, different rhythms. I mean, Bill couldn't concentrate on his sermon. He was mesmerized by that boy's feet. He stuttered around, and finally he gave up and pronounced a benediction. People were kind. They were speaking to Bill. And then he said, that little boy comes running up, Brother Bill, my mama has invited you to come to lunch with us. Bill said, that's the least he should have done for ruining my sermon. So he goes to lunch, and he's greeted warmly, and the boy shows him around the farm. He shows him the little chicken house where he's responsible for the eggs, and they have a great lunch, and Bill says goodbye and goes back to school. On Thursday, he goes to the post office there at the university and opens up his box. He pulls out a letter, and it falls, and it clanks when it hits the floor. And so he walks over to the side, and he opens it up and pours it out. There's a letter with $1.53 in change. The letter reads, Dear Bill, I'm sending you all my egg money so you can go to seminary to learn to be a better preacher. Signed by the boy. Bill thought it was the cutest thing he had ever seen, and he was just so impressed. He remembered the number that he had written down for the mother, so he calls her and told her the story, and he said, I'm just tickled to death, and now what's your address? I want to send the money back. And she said, Brother Bill, I've got news for you. You can't send it back. And what's more, he plans to send you next week his egg money from next week. And he tells me he's going to send you all of his egg money because he wants you to be a better preacher. Well, I need to send this back. Bill said, no, I can't let you send it back because he's taking better care of those chickens than he's ever taken care of them. He wants to be a responsible steward so he can help you be better. And the next week, the egg money came, and the next week, the egg money came, and the next week, the egg money came, the next month, and the next year, the egg money was still coming. And when I heard Bill tell this story, he said just last week, this little boy got into his jet plane and he flew to Houston to check on his investment. He was still investing. Bill said it got to a point where it wasn't funny or cute anymore. He'd go to his post office and he'd get the little envelope, and he was known that some little boy is working hard to take care of those chickens so he can send us egg money. And he got down on his knees beside his bed in his dorm and says, "Dear God, make me worthy of the kind of love and trust that this little boy is putting in me." And he said it changed everything. For me, C's were no longer good enough. The minimum becoming the maximum on every essay was no longer. I was doing the absolutely very best I could because some boy was investing in me to be the best I could. I had to live up to such high expectations out of my generosity, out of my gratitude for what he is doing for me. Wow. We can make investments in people's lives just by being generous. Amen.